everyone. Hello, hello. And welcome to session 9 of our study on the Gospel of Mark. And happy Hanukkah to those of you who are here. It is the third night of Hanukkah, and we lit our Hanukkah at home with our 3 candles tonight. And now there's a big Hanukkah. The Hanukkah candle thing is not called a menorah. It's called a Hanukkah. Menorah has 7 branches. A Hanukkah has 9, one for each of the 8 days of Hanukkah, and then an additional one for what they call the caretaker candle, which you use to light the other ones, called the shamas. And what is Hanukkah? Hanukkah is the Feast of Dedication. Jesus celebrated Hanukkah as well. That's in the Gospel of John, 10th chapter, somewhere between verse 20 and 25. It says about Jesus going to the Feast of Dedication, that he was in Jerusalem for it, in the temple, in Solomon's colonnade, walking around. And then he teaches on Hanukkah as well. Hanukkah is about, there was a time when the Jerusalem and the temple was in the control of the Seleucid Empire area, which is now in Syria. And they were interested in wiping out Judaism and the practice of Judaism. And so they invaded the temple. They brought a pig into the temple, sacrificed a pig on the altar of the temple, and so on, and made it unfit for Jewish ceremonial worship. And after the Maccabee rebellion, about 175 years before Jesus or so, they expelled the Seleucids from it, and they needed to rededicate the temple for worship. There was only enough consecrated oil to last for 1 night in the big lamp of dedication, which would have to be lit for 8 nights. But there was a miraculous event that God sufficed that 1 jar of oil to last for all 8 nights. And that's why it's called the Feast of Dedication, because as a result they were able to dedicate the temple. And Hanukkah is a time where you give thanks for God and for the dedication not only of the temple, but the dedication of our lives as well. So that's what Hanukkah is, and that's what they're celebrating. A Hanukkah. I'm not making it up. Some people call it a Hanukkah menorah, and you don't go to jail for that. I've been in Jerusalem for Hanukkah, and there's this beautiful big Hanukkah right at the what you would call the Wailing Wall or the Western Wall, and watch that lit every night, and then walk through the streets of the old city of Jerusalem, and everybody's got candles in the windows. Beautiful, beautiful time. And traditionally you eat fried foods, because foods made with oil, because it's the festival of oil. And that's why you have potato pancakes, or latkes as they're known, or sufganiot, like little jelly donuts fried in oil as well. 1 per night, 1 additional one tonight until all the 8 are lit. That's right. Seleucid. Antiochus Epiphanes was the name of the emperor at that time. And the Jews under his rule called him, which means Antiochus, the vision of God. The people under his rule called him Antiochus Epimanes, which means Antiochus who's out of his mind. So it's a good nickname. All right, but we're here in the Gospel of Mark. So welcome, hello everybody who's not here but elsewhere, and hello you who are here. And let's get underway with some exciting stuff. But first of all, I always forget to ask, but try to remember. Is there anything from last week that was left undone that you thought, boy, I'd like to know more about this, or my goodness, you were wrong about that? No? Great. So, Mark chapter 4, verses 35 through 36. That day, when evening came, he said to his disciples, "Let's go over to the other side." Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat. And there were also other boats with him. So we're going to be having the storm at sea in tonight's study. But let's take a look just for a minute at the big picture and step back from this tight focus we have on chapter 4. And there's a section beginning right here, extends all the way to chapter 6. in which Jesus continues to spend so much of his time either right by the Sea of Galilee or on the Sea of Galilee. And there's some interesting connections in this section. There's some episodes, and in the first episode, the panicked disciples rouse Jesus from sleep. He's sleeping in the boat, and they wake him up. In the next to last episode, Jesus rouses a girl from the sleep of death. People are always going to sleep and being raised to awareness in this section. There's a good quote that I wanted to share with you. In this section, Jesus is shown to possess power to still outward storms that threaten life and to still the inward storms of torment and grief that threaten our souls. We learn in these scenes that Jesus is not only sovereign over the demonic forces and debilitating and defiling illnesses, but he's also sovereign over the potent forces of nature and of death. And that's what this whole 2-chapter section of 4 to 6 is about. In fact, you can even stretch this section a little bit earlier, all the way to chapter 3 through to chapter 6. Because despite this, all of the miracles that Jesus performs, this whole section concludes with the report of the rejection of his own hometown in Nazareth, in the same way that the first section of the Gospel of Mark concluded with his rejection by Pharisees and Herodians. All the time in the Gospel of Mark, you've got people who are saying, oh, Jesus is the guy, I'm going to follow him. But you've also got people who are saying, Jesus is not the guy, get lost. As the parable of the sower outlined, remember the sower and the seeds, and some seeds grow and others just wither. Some are unable to hear and bear fruit. And that's what we're going to be hearing in this section too. There's an even a better sense of connection in this whole section. And this section highlights people who are desperate and who are in desperate situations. So you've got the disciples who are desperate. They're fearing death by drowning. You've got a demon-possessed man who's desperate to be delivered of his tormentors. You've got Jairus who's desperate for his daughter to be healed and raised. You've got a woman with the issue of blood who's in desperation, we're told. They actually use that word. In desperation, she spent all she had on doctors and is coming to Jesus as a last resort. It's interesting, in the Gospel of Mark, it says she spent all of her money on doctors, and they took all her money, but they did nothing to cure her. In the Gospel of Luke, which is written by a physician, it's the woman had expended all of her money on physicians, but they were unable to find a cure. You see the sort of the difference in tone? Mark is saying, the doctors ripped her off. Luke is saying, they tried their best, but it was just... And what's very interesting is that those who are not desperate, who encounter Jesus in these few chapters, the Pharisees and so on, they're the ones who reject Jesus. They have nothing at stake in the outcome of what's going on with Jesus. Yeah, Jesus, we don't care about you. You go away. So there's something about the need that we bring to Jesus which enables us to accept him and recognize who he is. It's also characteristic of fearful reactions. Jesus' miracles don't always achieve the expected result. The disciples are terrified when Jesus calms the storm. You think they'd be happy. The Gerasenes were afraid when Jesus healed the man who was tormented by demons, and they begged Jesus to leave. The sick woman who was healed, we read in that very same verse that she was trembling with fear. The people of after the healing, she was trembling with fear. The people of Nazareth react with skepticism, and it says they took offense at him. The reactions which Jesus' miracles produce are not always predictable, but sometimes quite unpredictable as well. Any comments or questions about anything like that before we press on with a more specific look at these verses? Okay. So, Mark chapter 4, 35, 36. That day when evening came, he said to his disciples, let's go over to the other side. Now, if you remember, Jesus had been standing in a boat and teaching to people on shore because the crowds were too intense for him to risk being on shore. So he said, let's go to the other side, leaving the crowd behind. They took him along just as he was in the boat, and there were also other boats with him. So, he said, let's go to the other side. What's the other side? Well, we've talked about this in a couple of lessons past. It means to cross that imaginary line more or less drawn down the center of the Sea of Galilee from the input of the Jordan River to the output of the Jordan River. If you're on one side, you're on one side. If you're on the other side, you're on the other side. And in this case, chapter 5 also shows us that the other side was the region of the Gerasenes, a non-Jewish enclave along the eastern shore of the lake at the base of the Golan Heights. And going there to this non-Jewish area would certainly bring Jesus away from the crowds that had been pressing in on him. So here's a little map. You've got your little potato-shaped Sea of Galilee. Hopefully this potato has absolutely no infection of any kind. And you can see where the Jordan River comes in at the top and where the Jordan River goes out at the bottom. And if you draw a line between that, that's the other side. And on the side where, I always get my right and left, so this is, what side is this? This is my left? This is my left. On the left side, dyslexia is a terrible thing, isn't it? On the side where it says Galilee, that's the Jewish side. On the side where it says Decapolis, that's the Gentile, the non-Jewish side. More or less just as it is, largely is today. And you can see where a little star is, where it says Sea of Galilee. Just beside of, you'll see a star, which says Kersa or Kursi, or it says that might be the original Gergesa. And Gadara is lower down as well. But that region, it says in Mark that he came to the region of the Gerasenes. They were the ones who had the political control of the area. So that's the side of the lake that Jesus is on. For those of you who have traveled with me to Israel and have stayed at Kibbutz and Gev, anybody here stayed at Kibbutz and Gev? A few of you? Yeah? So that's about 500 meters away from where we're talking right now. It's just a little bit up the hill from where we stayed. It says in the text that they brought him in the boat just as he was. And what an interesting little line that I've always wondered about, and I've scoured commentaries and I've never found a reasonable explanation for this, other than it being a further evidence of its eyewitness character. Remember, the Gospel of Mark is an eyewitness account of the Apostle Peter of these events. And that's a neat little eyewitness thing. You know, it's like somebody saying, oh, I went and knocked on his door, and he came to the door, and he was just, obviously, I woke him up. He was dressed very, very slovenly. Or in this case, we brought him along the boat just as he was. Just that little throwaway line lends that impression, that strong impression of this being an eyewitness observation. As well as the later observation in the same little story, that Jesus was in the stern of the boat. He wasn't in the bow of the boat. Some years ago when I was preaching this sermon in Guildwood, I said I described Jesus as being in the front of the boat. And I was taken to task by one of the sailors in the congregation who said, it's the stern of the boat. I said, yes, that's right. He said, that's the back, not the front. I said, oh, well, yes, of course. My knowledge doesn't go to seafaring very well. But it says that his head was on a cushion. Jesus was in the stern of the boat with his head on a cushion. It's not that Jesus was just in the boat. Now we know exactly where he was in the boat, and even his head was resting on a cushion. It's a beautiful little eyewitness detail. The word for cushion is not like comfy cushion, but probably one of the sandbags used as ballast in the boat, but it was a pillow in that case. It probably, what I think it means when it says just as he was, remember that Jesus is standing out on the boat. Okay, so he's out on the Sea of Galilee in the boat, and the crowd, you're the crowd on the soil, right on the shore, and then Jesus says, let's go to the other side. And maybe they say to Jesus, oh, do you want to get something from the house first, or do you want to grab a bite to eat? No, let's just go as we are right now. I think that's what it's referring to, so they just pull away. This is a great painting of Jesus on the Sea of Galilee. I love this one. It gives you an idea of the water, just sort of boiling up, with Jesus peacefully sleeping in the stern of the boat, which I've, again, am given to understand that's the back part of the boat there. And Jesus dreaming away, head on a cushion, and the disciples all convinced they're about to die. Now, Ballast? Ballast is some weight that you put in a boat in either the front of the boat or the back of the boat so that the boat doesn't tip one way or the other. That was the question, what does ballast mean? So you might think to yourself, well, goodness sakes, this looks like a heck of a storm for a kind of a small lake, 10 miles by 16 miles at its widest points. But this is what it says. A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. Okay, so that looks like this. Right? Now, we've seen in weeks past the geography of the Sea of Galilee and how the winds, the Sea of Galilee is in a bowl, and the winds come in from the Mediterranean, and they kind of chur it up like a big mixmaster. And they can whip the water into a deadly froth. Now, I'm not making this up. Here are some reports from August 2017, which was a particularly tough year on the Sea of Galilee. This was a newspaper report from an Israeli newspaper. Since the beginning of 2017, and this was written in August 2017. Since the beginning of 2017, 7 people have drowned in the Sea of Galilee, with dozens of others having to be rescued. Acting commander of Marine Police at the lake warns of strong winds from the west, again, that's coming off the Mediterranean, that can carry swimmers away to deep waters. The connection between all of the drowning cases this year is the wind, said Yochai Lankri, the acting commander of the Kinneret, which is another name for Sea of Galilee, the Kinneret's Marine Police Unit. One of the times when I was at the Sea of Galilee, actually I just left, was on my way to Jerusalem, in the newspaper, it indicated that the day before there was a quick storm on the Sea of Galilee, and some young people who were on, young men who were on these inflatable rafts, just like a mattress, air mattress, I guess we call them. And they were floating, beautiful sunny day, calm, peaceful nights, and they were floating on their mattresses, and all of a sudden, whoomph, out comes one of these sudden storms from the Mediterranean. And these guys were swept out and drowned. And it took them many days to find. And these are, strong, good swimming young men. This is a real situation. So, not surprising that the disciples themselves were terrified. They knew the danger of a strong storm like that. And Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion, and the disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" Well, fair enough. This is the great Rembrandt Storm on the Sea of Galilee. It's an amazing painting. You'll see how Rembrandt has kind of invoked a cross with the way that the mast of the boat is and the sail going across the top. And I don't know how well you can see this. You've got a guy in the front of the boat trying for all of his life to keep the sails there. The storm is strong. The ropes are breaking free. And if you go close up, here you've got them just waking up Jesus. They're grabbing him and shaking him. And there's two things that I love this whole painting. Unfortunately, this painting was stolen, by the way, a number of years ago I believe it was from the Rijksmuseum, and it's never been seen since. So we have pictures of it, but you can't actually go and see the painting. But you've got Jesus there kind of lit as Peter and John are grabbing him. You've got a guy hanging over the edge of the boat, having a good barf. You see that? Whenever I look at a painting, I always think to myself, well, which one would be me? Well, that's me right there. But also very neat, you've got a guy just beside the guy barfing, you've got a fellow sort of reaching over and holding on to a rope. Do you see that guy that I'm talking about? He's got kind of a red hat or a pink-colored hat and a blue. You know who that is? That's Rembrandt. He painted himself into the painting. So he has that thing too. He puts himself into the scene. And that's, it's him because, first of all, it looks like him. And secondly, he's always looking right at you from these paintings. So he's saying, look at the storm. Look at the storm. Now, the fact that Jesus, it is mentioned that he's asleep in the middle of this chaos, actually tells us something. It tells us that Jesus is more than who we just think he is. For instance, a faithful person is said to be able to sleep through the worst crises. In Job chapter 11, we read, "You will be secure because there is hope. You will look about you and take your rest in safety. You will lie down with no one to make you afraid." Or in the Psalms, in peace I will lie down and sleep, for you alone, Lord, make me dwell in safety. Or in Proverbs, when you lie down, you will not be afraid. When you lie down, your sleep will be sweet. So just in mentioning that Jesus is asleep in the middle of the storm, we know that he's a man of great faith who has complete trust in God, and as a result is able to lie down and sleep in the midst of this chaos. But it is chaotic, because the disciples say, "Don't you care if we drown?" So in waking Jesus, the disciples were accusing Jesus of not caring about their fate. There's no indication that they thought that he could solve the problem. They didn't say, "Teacher, make this storm stop," because I doubt they thought that was possible. Their concern was that Jesus didn't care that they were going through this. I don't know, have any of you ever been awakened at night by a spouse who is concerned that there is a problem somewhere in the house? Wake up! Wake up! They say, "What? What's the matter?" "I can't sleep." Why? What? "I think there's something in the house." "Well, did you hear something?" "No." "Well, what is the problem?" I don't know, I can't sleep, so I thought I'd wake you up." You know, they just want to share the misery, right? They don't think you can solve the problem. But they want you to be as miserable as they are in the midst of it all. They want him to share their anxiety. Now, that's not entirely unreasonable. Nobody likes to be alone when they're afraid, right? And the shoe is on the other foot in Gethsemane. Okay, on the night of the arrest, the disciples fall asleep in Jesus' hour of need. And he asks them why they couldn't stay awake for him during his crisis. It goes like this. Matthew accounts it this way. Jesus said to them, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me." He's begging them, be with me in this time that I need you. Going a little further, he fell with his face to the ground and prayed, "My Father, if it's possible, may this cup be taken from me, yet not as I will, but as you will." Then he returned to his disciples and found them sleeping. "Couldn't you men keep watch with me for 1 hour?" he asked Peter. "Watch and pray so you'll not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." Now, Matthew fits a little sermon into that one as well. But in Mark, again, we have this real eyewitness character of the same event, where we read, "Once more Jesus went away and prayed the same thing. When he came back, he again found them sleeping because their eyes were heavy. They did not know what to say to him." They didn't know it. Can you just imagine Peter saying that? Peter's there and he's saying, and Jesus, he asked us to stay up with him. But man, we were exhausted. Our eyes were just heavy. We couldn't keep our eyes open. And he came back and we had all fallen asleep. And he said, "Couldn't you just stay up with me for an hour?" And we didn't know what to say to him. It just has that beautiful eyewitness character. We didn't know what to say to him. Because what can you say? Well, in this case, the disciples are shaking Jesus awake. And this is what happens. Jesus got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." And then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. Well, that's quite remarkable, and there's a couple of things to point out in that. He rebuked the wind. Is Melissa? Where's Melissa? She had to step out for a minute. There you are. Okay, Melissa, read that word. Very good. Epitimesin. And epitimesin is rebuke. The word is, I'm trying to help Melissa. She's studying Greek, and she's not very good at it yet, so I'm helping her along. Epitimesin, and it's a word for rebuke, and it's often used to describe Jesus' commands to the evil spirits. And with Peter, for instance, when Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan." Remember when Jesus says that to Peter? It says he rebuked him. That's the same word that's being used. It's interesting that Jesus should use a word like that when he's talking effectively to the wind and to the waves. Since wind is an inanimate object, is the storm of a malevolent spiritual nature? Particularly ancient commentators asked this question a lot. They said, is this storm actually sent by evil forces to try to get rid of Jesus and the disciples once and for all? Is that why Jesus, shakes his fist effectively but rebukes them in the same language he uses when engaging with evil spirits? Well, hard to say, because Jesus uses the invisible yet forceful character of the wind as an illustration of the work of the Spirit elsewhere. For instance, in the Gospel of John, when he's talking about the Spirit. Is somebody? No, nobody's asking a question. When Jesus is talking about the Spirit, he says it's like the wind which blows whichever way it will. The Spirit's like the wind. Well, are malevolent spirits like that as well? Is this an instance where the wind is the sign of the work of a malevolent spirit? We don't know. But it is a question that was asked a great deal in the past. What happens is when Jesus commands the wind, and it gets completely calm. Again, here's the original verse. He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." Then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. That's a demonstration of divine power. We don't think of it that way. But when Jesus does that, he's effectively saying, "I am God." Many scriptures would back this up, but for instance, Psalm 107 is describing a terrible storm at sea. And it talks about the sailors like this. It says, they reeled and staggered like drunkards. Okay, you can just imagine them on the boat. I don't know if you've been on a boat during a storm. They were at their wits' end. Then they cried out to the Lord in their trouble, and he brought them out of their distress. He stilled the storm to a whisper. The waves of the sea were hushed. And they were glad when it grew calm, and he guided them to their desired haven. Now that could be a poem about this event. But that poem was written about 800 years before this event. So Mark is recalling this as well, and Jesus is doubtless recalling this as well, and the disciples are doubtless recalling this as well, saying, "Wow, that's just like Psalm 107." All he did was speak, and everything grew quiet. Another interesting thing to point out: the Bible describes it as a mega storm and then a mega calm. So Jesus' words, when he tells it to be still, it resulted in a complete reversal of conditions. The words used are literally a great storm suddenly blew up, and then when Jesus calmed it down, it was a great calm, a mega and mega. And there's something important there to note too. The power of the storm is not greater than the power of the calm. In our own lives, we often perceive storms as more powerful than calms. There's a sermon there which I might preach someday if I live long enough, that we get really riled up with storms. Like when there's a big crisis in our life. Oh boy, now I'm going to, Jesus help me through this time. I was in such a crisis, I called out to God, and you must be there, help me now. But this storm story tells us that the calm is just as powerful. How often is it nice and calm and beautiful and you got no troubles and it's a perfect day where you think, oh, I have to call out to God. But both things are equally powerful. The storm and the calm are equally powerful in this story. That's pretty neat. I didn't notice that until I was preparing this study and going through the text in the Greek. Hear that, Melissa? I was preparing the study with the original Greek text. Hope you're impressed. So it continues. Mark chapter 4, verse 40. He said to the disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" I'm not sure if Jesus is criticizing them for their fear during the storm or for their fear when Jesus calms the storm. Because when Jesus calms the storm, they realize who Jesus is, and then they're afraid. A couple of verses might help us here. Faith is trust in God. Psalm 46, here's an excellent example. Once again, it looks like this story was taken right from it. God is our refuge and strength and ever-present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth give way and the mountains fall into the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam and the mountains quake with their surging. Again, God is our refuge and our strength. Who was the refuge and strength for the disciples in this storm? Jesus, who calms the storm as only God can do. And then what's the reaction of the disciples when Jesus calms the storm? Do they say, hooray, and break out the Parcheesi board? No. They were terrified. And they asked each other, who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him. So again, if you go back to this verse where Jesus says, why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? Is he criticizing them for being afraid of the storm or afraid of him? Because in the very next verse, it's him they're afraid of. And is their lack of faith the fact that despite all that's going on, they still don't perceive who Jesus is? Because it seems unreasonable to criticize somebody for being afraid when it looks as though they're going to die as a result of a storm. Would Jesus criticize them for that? Or is he saying, why don't you have faith? Why don't you believe who I am? Didn't you realize that I have the power to do this because of who I am? But they're terrified. Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him. Yes. It's still pretty fresh. If we go by the Gospel of Mark chronology, it's certainly within the first short while after calling the disciples. He's still just gathering a crowd. Crowds are just beginning to press in on him. So, I don't know, 6 months, something like that, maybe a year.
Did they witness any miracles?
Yes. Yeah, they were a lot of healings and demons being cast out. And, blind people seeing. Remember, Jesus' reputation of a healer was such that the crowds were leaping on him in order to find healing. So they had witnessed all those kinds of things. But it's one thing for somebody to be healed. It's a paralyzed guy lowered through the roof. It's another thing for the forces of nature to be subdued so dramatically like that. So the curtain is lifting on Jesus' identity. And Psalm 89, again, the Gospels are always going to be quoting the Psalms and Isaiah over and over and over again. That's their textbook of faith. Here's Psalm 89. In the counsel of the holy ones, God is greatly feared. He is more awesome than all who surround him. Who is like you, Lord God Almighty? You, Lord, are mighty, and your faithfulness surrounds you. You rule over the surging sea. When its waves mount up, you still them. Now, the disciples know this psalm as well as you know all the words to Jingle Bells or Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. Or even Frosty the Snowman. That's a tougher one. But they knew these words. And so when Jesus calmed the storm, they knew that they just weren't working with a magician or somebody like Kreskin with the... They knew they were dealing with God, and they were terrified. Lyle. Lyle says it doesn't amaze him because he's been the same way, that you've been afraid in situations and then God bailed you out. You go, what the heck? I didn't expect that. Yeah, exactly. Well, we all are, right? All the time. Remember the Rembrandt painting? He says, I'm one of the disciples. I'm just like these guys. I'm in the same boat, right? So are we. So are we. We are the disciples in that regard. That's it for the storm story. Yeah, Joan. Okay.
But you said something, the Psalms are almost prophetic.
They're more than almost prophetic. They are prophetic in many. Are the Psalms prophetic? Yes. if you, almost every event in the life of Jesus, you can find a parallel to in the Psalms.
Who are they talking about? You quoted from Psalm 107,
Yes.
and it says they staggered.
Yeah, they're staggering. These guys are like on a boat, the big storm, and they're staggering in like drunken men because the boat is going all the ways, and all of a sudden the storm is calm. You, God, calmed the storm. So the calming of the storm, that supernatural action of the calming of the storm, that's God at work. Only God can do that. And so this is the disciples realizing, wait a minute, we're in the boat with God, the Lord God Almighty. This isn't just a guy. Now, why is this important? Again and again you hear various modern commentators or writers saying, oh, well, Jesus never thought he was the Messiah. Jesus never pictured himself as God. That's a later invention of the church. But every story that deals with Jesus and every reaction of the disciples is completely contrary to that. These stories, these events, very clearly are lifting the curtain and showing you that Jesus is God, and all of his actions speak to that. All the way through Mark, we've been seeing that. Who can forgive sins but God alone, say the Pharisees. What are you doing? Healing this guy and forgiving his sin. Well, you must think you're God. All the way along, every action and teaching of Jesus points to who he is, just like this. And what's the reaction of the disciples? Scared witless, because they find themselves in the presence of God. Well, the next story is even bigger. Maybe not even bigger, but big. It still deals with water, as all these stories in this section does. Mark chapter 5, verse 1. You never thought we'd get to chapter 5, did you? Here we are. They came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes. Where is it? It's that whole area. Gerasa, modern Jerash, is actually 30 miles from the lake, so it's not that town, but it's that region controlled by the town. For instance, when I'm visiting, so oftentimes when I'm in Israel, people say, where are you from? Canada. Where in Canada? I don't say, Charlottetown, because what does that mean to somebody who grows up in Israel? You say, on the Atlantic coast side of Canada. Oh, I have a brother-in-law in Vancouver. Is that close? And you say, well, no, it's a little further away than that. Same type of general area variance that they're giving here. Now, a lot of people today point to Kursi, this town close to Kibbutz Engev, which is a version of the name Gerasa, all of which are members of a big provincial area called the Decapolis. So Kursi is a spot which is now marked. This is right on the edge. Those hills are the Golan Heights. And Kursi was the home of a very big monastery in Byzantine times, and the remains of it are very, very, very visible today. And if you go to this monastery, which is built there, if you look up the hill from the monastery, you'll see some more grayish-looking areas. And those are tombs carved into the hillside. Okay, that was the burial ground. That was the cemetery. And if you go a little bit closer, you can see that sort of a stairway leading up there, and there's various caves and tombs in the rocks, and there was a little chapel right on that spot. And that spot is where people, this monastery was built to mark, and they said, this is where it happened. This is where this miracle took place. And so they built this chapel there. There's the chapel floor. I climbed up there at great personal risk to take this photograph for you. I hope you appreciate it. And you can see there's a mosaic floor where the chapel was and so on, and there's tombs in behind. I've stuck my head in several of them. Fortunately, no demons, best I know, were floating around. In the distance now, because the sea has receded, in the distance is the Sea of Galilee, and that white sort of thing at the top where you think the sea is starting, that's actually a big banana plantation. Lots of bananas grown in Israel. It kind of takes the romance away from the story that there's a banana plantation in the way. I don't think there were bananas there at the time of Jesus. So you get this area, this mountainous area here in your mind. And then we read the story, which is introduced with a great quote. Jesus embarks on a daring invasion to claim alien turf under enemy occupation and reveals there's no place in the world into which God's reign does not intend to extend itself. So Jesus is not just in Israel, he's going into disputed territory as well. Yes. Okay, in the picture, it looks like the monastery crumbled and the chapel up on the hill. Was there an earthquake? Yes, there was a series of earthquakes. A big one in about early to mid 300s AD, and then a really big one in the 600s. And that knocked down just about everything in this whole area. Very few buildings remained standing after that earthquake in the 600s. Yeah, that's when that monastery was abandoned. So Mark chapter 5, verse 2. When Jesus stepped out of the boat, immediately a man ran out of the tombs with an unclean spirit and met him. And he lived among the tombs, and no one could restrain him anymore, even with a chain. For he'd often been restrained with shackles and chains, but the chains he wrenched apart, and the shackles he broke in pieces, and no one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always howling and bruising himself with stones. What a horrible, horrible situation. What a terrible, terrible image of a desperate, desperate affliction. Now, it's a very specific description, because this guy shows all the signs. He's a demonized soul. He's screaming in his tortured isolation. He lives in the unclean place of the dead. He's become himself a dwelling place for unclean spirits. He's like a raving graveyard himself. And tombs were frequently located in caves, and they were known as haunts for demons. You know, many people today are afraid to walk through a cemetery because they're afraid of ghosts or goblins. I myself am perfectly comfortable walking through a cemetery. I don't think there's many safer places to be. But in this case, you know, people stayed away from tombs, particularly in this kind of an area, afraid that they would be haunted by the spirits or the demons. But what's interesting is in that big description, guy lived among the tombs, nobody could restrain him, wrenched apart the chains, night and day at the tombs, he was howling, bruising himself with stones, and so on. Now, he shows all the signs because in rabbinic writings, even from before the time of Jesus, the rabbis wrote down 4 characteristics of madness. How do you know somebody is mad? They run around at night, they stay overnight in burial places, they tear apart their clothes, and they destroy what has been given to them. And so, if you're an ancient rabbi, you read this story, you're going, I think this guy's got a problem. Checks all the boxes. Right? It's like, you know, I've been tested for COVID now 3 times because I had a sore throat and all the rest of it. I had to go and get tested. And they ask for the sign. Have you got this? Have you got that? Has this? They ask for the signs. And if you check enough boxes off, then, you know, forget it. You can't come to Bible study. If you check these boxes off, you got bigger problems than COVID. So the man is exhibiting all the classic symptoms of madness or possession. And it says, when he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and bowed down before him, and he shouted at the top of his voice, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me." For Jesus had said to him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." This is important. Notice what happened here. Jesus had said to him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." The unclean spirit was still in the man. This is a tough case. And we're going to find out why it's a tough case. Somehow the man manages to approach Jesus despite his demons, and they don't immediately respond to Jesus' commands. Go out of the man. Well, the demons enter into a debate. What do you want with us? And what do they say? Jesus, Son of the Most High God. You notice how demons are always identifying Jesus? That's because in ancient spiritual warfare, the first thing you do, you gain power over somebody by using their name. Okay. Yeah, Lyle, are you waving your paper to cool down, or have you got a question there? Okay. Yeah, well, these guys live in a spiritual realm. Imagine if the world was dark and there were only certain sources of light. The demons were sources of light, okay? They glowed. And then Jesus comes and he's like a spotlight. And so immediately they know who he is. They have him figured out. They see through his humanity and right to his divinity. They're blinded by his divinity. So how do the demons recognize Jesus? Because they're operating in the spiritual realm as Jesus is. So this argument breaks out with the demons. They enter into a debate, and they try to get advantage by saying Jesus' name and the name of God. You see how they're invoking God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me. These are tough demons. Particularly hard case. So Jesus then asks him to get on even playing field again. What's your name? And you know what? They don't tell him. They say, my name is Legion, for we are many. So it basically says, my name is plenty of us, because there's lots of us. That's not his name. That's a description of what's going on. They're not giving Jesus an edge in this debate. But nonetheless, they know they're outclassed. It says he begged them earnestly not to send them out of the country. Now, famously, we know there was on the hillside a great herd of swine that was feeding, and the unclean spirits begged him, send us into the swine. Let us enter them. They know they're going to lose. But they're trying to trick Jesus into just diverting them into another occupation of hosts where they can continue to work their trouble. But Jesus turns the tables on the demons, demands their name, and they say, look, we have many names, we're not going to tell you our name, but they know they're outranked and outpowered, beg to enter the swine. Why do they want to enter the swine? That's a good question. We're into very strange stuff here. It was a popular belief in the first century, time of Jesus, that evil spirits were not content to wander aimlessly about. They abhor a vacuum. They want to inhabit something, preferably a human host, but if no human hosts around, a bunch of pigs will do. Anything is better than wandering in dry places or being consigned to the sea if you're a land demon. Apparently, land demons don't like the sea. And you think, well, where did this weird stuff come from? Well, how about Matthew 12:43, where we read, when an impure spirit comes out of a person, it goes through arid places seeking rest and does not find it. Okay, this was the idea. The spirit, wanders around looking for a new host. I can tell you a great story, but we don't have time. And then we read, so he gave them permission to enter the swine. And the unclean spirits came out and entered the swine. And the herd, numbering about 2,000, it's a big herd, rushed down the steep bank into the sea, and they were drowned in the sea. Aha! Jesus fooled them. They thought they were getting away with it. But what happens? They enter the pigs go mad, run off, drown in the sea. They go right through the banana plantation and into the sea. So, remember, who's king of the sea? Who's got power over the wind and the waves? Jesus. What happens to these pigs? Right into the waves. The destructive power of the sea that almost sank the disciples' boat now swallows up the pigs. Jesus, who has just demonstrated his dominion over the sea, does not need to know the names of the evil spirits in order to drive them out. The demons fall victim to their own designs, and they tumble headlong into chaos. This, by the way, when the demons inhabit the herd of pigs, we actually have a special kind of food that recalls that event. Deviled ham. Sorry very much. Thank you very much. Thank you. Deviled. So the demons trying to trick Jesus, they fall into their own trap. They end up in the water, which is not where they wanted to go. In the Testament of Solomon, we quoted this weird book that existed a couple of hundred years before Jesus. A demon is about to be exorcised, and he pleads, do not condemn me to water. Okay, demons, the idea was that a land demon couldn't survive in water. Again, I told you this is weird stuff. But from a Jewish perspective, the scene is a double victory. Unclean spirits and unclean animals. Remember, pigs are not kosher. This is a non-Jewish part of the world, and so there's big herds of pigs. There are pig farms in Israel today, because there's a big market for pork among all the Russian immigrants who came in. So there are pig farms in Israel today. Traditionally, the pigs are supposed to be kept off the ground, 3 feet off the ground. So they're on raised platforms. They're not supposed to touch the ground. But anyway, that's another big story. But in this story, unclean animals and unclean spirits are both wiped out in one fell swoop, plus a human being is cleansed. 2,000 pigs. There's a very specific reason why the number 2,000 is being used. Now, this is neat. I bet you don't hear this anywhere else. How Mark's audience might read this. Let's say you're reading this and it's about, 85 AD. Okay, one of Mark's original groups of audience. Story's been around a little while. Those reading this story after the destruction of Jerusalem, which was in 70 AD, might have made another connection to the story. They're going, ho, ho, ho! There's something going on here. The 10th Roman Legion, which is called the Fretensis, took part in the sieges of Jerusalem and Masada, and was stationed in Jerusalem after its fall. They're the guys who policed Jerusalem and persecuted the Jews after the fall of Jerusalem. They destroyed the temple. What was the image of the 10th Fretensis that was on their banners? A wild boar, a pig. That's their banner. That's their mascot. You see here that stone, that pillar marking one of their camps. Legio X, that's the 10th, and then Fretensis afterwards. That was their mascot. If you go to Jerusalem today, right after you go through the Jaffa Gate into the Old City, there's a group of hotels, old hotels on your left-hand side. If you go into the courtyard of the old hotels, you'll see this pillar. And you say, oh, that's an interesting pillar. Well, that pillar is 2,000 years old. And that pillar marks the center of the camp of the 10th Fretensis Legion. Legio X FR, Fretensis. That's the abbreviation of it. So if you're in Jerusalem at that time, your great enemy is the 10th Fretensis, who were symbolized by the boar. Now, the 10th Fretensis had a complement of 1,000 horses, and guess how many soldiers? 2,000. Okay, and what was their other symbol? I don't have that picture. They're larger. The Fretensis means the group from the maritime countries. And the other symbol that they have on their flag is a boat. And so they came by boat to Israel. Their image is the swine. Where do they end up? Drowned in the sea in a herd of pigs. So there was a double meaning going on to the people in the readers of Mark. Many Jews would have liked nothing better than to see the Roman legion guilty of defiling the land, destroying the holy city, and killing and enslaving thousands, driven into the sea. And there's this wonderful account from Mark of the pigs falling into the sea. Isn't that neat? There's just all kinds of levels going on when you start to dig into these stories. Right? We get it. Oh, a great story, Man, demons delivered, pigs, sea, wow. But those original audiences are just reading it on so many other levels. Yeah. Not in Israel. No, the pig farms are very contained operations where, as I say, they're all on a raised platform and so on. But in those days, yeah, just... You know where wild pigs are running free right now, causing a real problem so that people can't even walk around at night? Haifa, in Israel, Haifa, because wild boars are naturally part of that environment. And in many parts of the world, like in Hawaii, and even in places in Canada, since COVID hit and everybody's staying inside, who's multiplying very quickly? Wild pigs. People are attacked in Haifa just about every night by gangs of wild pigs. What would the people in Haifa like to read as far as a story goes? This story. They say, drive them into the sea. Right? So yeah, in parts of the world, more today than 50 years ago. Wild pigs are a problem. YouTube Hawaii wild pigs when you get home, and you'll have an idea. They're destroying Hawaii. So the swineherds ran off. They told it in the city and the country. People came to see what it was that happened. They came to Jesus. They saw the demoniac sitting there clothed and in his right mind. The very man who had had the legion. And they were afraid. Those who had seen what happened to the demoniac and to the swine reported it. They began to beg Jesus to leave their neighborhood. Remember how we said earlier that miracle after miracle, so many people react with fear? So did these people. Oh, we can't handle this. This guy, we wrapped him up with chains. We know what to do with him. He was a problem, but we know what to do with him. This guy who comes and suddenly the pigs are floating in the Sea of Galilee, you know what? Better if you leave. So just as the disciples were afraid upon realizing they were in the presence of a divine power, the townspeople are terrified. Their fear overpowers any gratitude they might have felt. Guess what? If you said to the townspeople, would it be better if the guy with the demons drowned in the sea or 2,000 pigs? Ooh, easy choice, right? They fail to understand that Jesus' power is for good and for their good. Rather than the key to the city, they give him the cold shoulder because people are afraid of power they can't control. Yes? It appears as that the question is, with this guy being plagued by a legion, the story seems to indicate that there was more than one demon plaguing this guy. Enough to cause a vast herd of pigs to go hurtling into the lake. So there was a lot of them. And the word legion refers to a couple of thousand. So this guy had a problem. This guy had a big problem. So they said, Jesus, please leave. We can't deal with you. We just can't deal with you. And so as he was getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed by demons begged him that he might be with him. But Jesus refused and said to him, go home to your friends and family. Tell them how much the Lord has done for you and what mercy he has shown you. This is very, very unusual, isn't it? That Jesus would say, no, you can't follow me. So what's going on? Well, the spotlight of the story shifts back to the man. His fear, he's not afraid of Jesus anymore. He's seated. That's the position of a disciple, seated right beside Jesus. We hear all the way through the Gospels. Remember the story of Mary and Martha? One of them is working in the kitchen. And where's the other one? Seated. Seated at the feet of Jesus. That's the sign of the disciple. You're sitting at the feet of the Master. Okay? And he requests to be with Jesus. Just a few chapters ago, when Jesus was picking the apostles, it said they were chosen to be with him. That was their primary task, was to be with Jesus. This guy wants to be with Jesus. The community has begged Jesus to leave them, but the man begs to be with Jesus. So why doesn't Jesus say, okay, great, come on board. You're fulfilling all of the requirements to be a disciple. Well, it may have seemed like bad news to us. Jesus says, no, you can't come with me. But it's good news for the man who doubtless yearned for the warmth of family, a sense of place and identity, a sense of purpose. Jesus sends him back to his own house so that he can be restored to his family and friends. Again and again, when Jesus heals somebody, he says to them, go home. Take your mat, go home. Be reintegrated back into your community. But there's another reason Jesus says this. We read about the man. He went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis, this provincial area of 10 cities, how much Jesus had done for him, and everyone was amazed. So the man becomes an outside witness to the power of Jesus. So who are people going to listen to? They're not going to listen to Jesus. What have they said to Jesus? Get lost, Jesus. They're not going to listen to him. But Jesus leaves behind a local witness to his identity and mission. He does the same thing in Samaria. Samaritans are not going to listen to Jesus. He's a Jew. They hate the Jews. They're not going to listen to Jesus. So what does Jesus do? He sends the woman at the well as an advance guard into the city. And she says, this guy told me everything I've ever done. I think he's the Messiah. And so then the people begin to believe, and they come out to see Jesus. A community into which Jesus could not otherwise penetrate. That's a question for us. Who is there in your life who would hear better from you than from others what Jesus had done? If I tell somebody all kinds of things about Jesus, they're going to go, yeah, you're paid to do that. That's your job. Why should I believe you? But if you tell someone who you love something about what God is doing in your life, they'll listen to you. You have the credibility. You have the you have the doorway into their life that I don't have. Or in this case, that Jesus doesn't have until he's introduced by a friend. So there's a reversal going. Up till now, Jesus is constantly telling those who've been healed and delivered to not spread the news about what had happened. He says that in very strong terms. But in this case, Jesus reverses the pattern, instructing the man to tell everyone. Because this is a remote place. That same danger of unmanageable numbers of people crowding around Jesus and preventing him from ministering, which is why he told everybody else to keep it quiet, that's not a factor here. So he was able to say to the fellow, go tell everybody. And then after the ascension, when Jesus is about to ascend to the heavens, he tells the disciples, go tell everybody this good news, because that danger of the crowds does not exist here. So don't be like the people who have Jesus in their life but never tell anybody, because we don't have to be afraid of the big crowds here in Charlottetown pressing in on Jesus. Instead, be like this guy in the Decapolis and spread the good news. So, a final word about this Decapolis. What is it? Decapolis literally means the 10 cities. It's a league of free Greek cities under the protection of the Roman governor of Syria. And the cities are Damascus, Raphana, Dion, Canatha, Scythopolis, Gadar, Hippos, Pella, Gerasa, and Philadelphia. Not Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. During the time of Christ, the 10 cities of the Decapolis and the surrounding region were inhabited mostly by Gentiles, not by Jews. The area had a strong Greek influence, and a large number of the people living in there were soldiers who were given land instead of money. The area looks like this. The little blue part near the top, that's the Sea of Galilee. So you see how big this area of the Decapolis is. Okay, all those 10 cities. Most of them are on the east side of the Jordan. The one on the west side of the Jordan, which you can see sort of sticking out towards the left, that's Scythopolis. Are those of you who have been to Bet Shean in Israel? That's Bet Shean. Okay, that was the one on that side. And Jesus had quite an interesting ministry. Now, this ministry would pay off in a very important way for the church. Because Matthew notes that many people from the region of the Decapolis followed Jesus. In AD 69, when Jerusalem came under attack by Rome, and who attacked them? Quiz time. Were you paying attention? What was the name of the legion who attacked Jerusalem? The 10th Fretensis. Okay. When the 10th Fretensis came in and attacked, what happened to the Christians there? Well, Jesus, we're going to read in Mark chapter 13, Jesus gives extensive warning. He says, look, when you see this happening, when you see that happening, when you see the other thing happen, run. Don't walk, run. Leave everything behind and run. And the Christians did. Otherwise, they would have been destroyed. The entire Christian church would have been destroyed in Jerusalem. But the Christians took Jesus at his word, and they ran. Where did they run? To Pella, in the Decapolis, who offered a place of refuge for Christians who fled the coming siege because they themselves had become Christians, maybe as a result of that man who had been healed of the demons beginning to spread the word. So the cities of the Decapolis, which was the other side who said to Jesus, get lost, we don't want you here, 40 years later becomes a place welcoming the Christians who were then able to survive the attack of the Romans on Jerusalem in 70 AD. And then, by about 80 AD, were able to go back in and resettle the city of Jerusalem and establish the faith there. So in a wonderful way, that kind of repaid the efforts of Jesus to bring faith to the area. And it could be that that man who was healed of all those demons was the instrumental figure in the preservation of the church in 70 A.D. Isn't that a neat connection? Ooh, that makes me tingle. I don't know about you. Pella, Jordan these days is a wonderful archaeological spot. Again, it was destroyed in the earthquakes that had happened there, and you can see only ruins there, but there are some wonderful Christian evidences from that. Now, for the rest of the Gospel of Mark, Mark chapter 5, not the rest of the Gospel, for the rest of chapter 5, the stories of Jairus' daughter and the woman at the issue of blood, I'm going to refer you to my brilliant sermon of November the 14th, All in God's Good Time, where I really I go into great detail with those stories, and you can refresh your memories about them now. Any questions to wrap up before we go? Yes, Gary. I can tell you the schedule for December, which is the next slide. Good for you. Next week we do Mark chapter 6, and then we're on a Christmas break on December 14th, 21st, and 28th. I was planning to have a study here on the 14th, but the 14th happens to be a very significant birthday, milestone birthday in the life of someone very dear to me, and she will never forgive me if I don't actually take her out on her special birthday. So that's just edit. You can just take that right out of the thing there. But so next week we meet. So we meet next week. But then we have a 3-week break. And then our studies resume on January the 4th. Any questions about what we looked at tonight before we go? Amen. Lyle just said, the more you study the Bible, the more you can refer it to your own personal life. That's what's happening in the Gospel of Mark with all these references to the Psalms and Isaiah. Because the disciples are saying, the more we study the Psalms and Isaiah, the more we understand what Jesus is about and how it impacts our life. So Lyle, you're a good disciple, and you're continuing in the tradition of the disciples. Let's have a prayer before we go. Dear God, we just read about a man who was so terribly tormented, and his mind was torn in so many different ways. We know that there are people in our world and in our community, even in our own lives, whose minds are not clear and who are torn in so many different directions and who live lives of true misery. We pray that people in need of help will find it, that people in need of deliverance will find the assistance they need, and that all of us, those in need and those seeking help in so many other ways, might find our true deliverance in you. Help us to see you as you really are, the God who has come to rescue us all. We ask this in Christ our Lord. Amen. Amen, and God bless you. That was exciting stuff. How about this 10th for tenses stuff? Wow. Next time.